Continue developing the topic for the chapter 16 of the respiratory system. Uh, I mentioned before in the previous video about the atmospheric pressure and how much is the atmospheric pressure at the sea level. I mentioned before that it's 760 millimeters of mercury. And keep in mind this value in order to analyze what is the situation that can be different of that. Okay, how the 760 millimeters of mercury is composed? Is composed by the 100% the air that we inhale. 78%, the largest amount, is made by nitrogen, and 21% is made by oxygen. Only a tiny mini bit of 1% represent carbon dioxide. Another variable in our air at the sea level is the amount of water that represents the humidity in that air that we breathe. Obviously, living in that central coast, the humidity is average, is around 60–70%. But if we go to other tropical areas, like could be Florida, the humidity increased tremendously. But yes, 760 millimeters of mercury is composed by 78% of nitrogen, 21% of oxygen, and 1% of carbon dioxide, roughly. To talk about the ventilation and perfusion ratios, we need to start to understand what is the meaning of ventilation and what is the meaning of perfusion. Ventilation is understand that is the amount of air that reach the alveoli because it's basically related to air, to the air that we breathe in or the air that we breathe out. So that one is ventilation, the amount of air that reach or fills the alveolus, either in breathe in or breathe out. Now, what does it mean perfusion? Perfusion is defined about the amount of blood that reach the alveolus through the capillaries. The amount of blood that is flowing around the alveolus through the capillaries. And to understand how the ventilation and perfusion ratios is working, we need those two, ventilation and perfusion ratio. What does it mean? That because between together they determine the concentration, ideal concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide in our plasma. And when we talk about ventilation and perfusion, ideally refer to the area in the lungs around the alveoli. But we will see pretty soon that there is also a matching action in the systemic capillaries in order to keep that ventilation perfusion rate in ideal values. To understand a little bit more about the ventilation perfusion ratios and about the physiology of the respiratory system, we have to mention about the Henry's law. And Henry's law is the one that defines the amount of gas that can be dissolved in the liquid depends on three factors. So the amount of gas that can be dissolved in liquid depends on three factors. Two of them are the two first ones that you read over here, that the amount of gas that can be dissolved depends on the solubility of that gas in a liquid. That in this case is pretty much constant because we know how much can be dissolved oxygen, how much can be dissolved carbon dioxide. The second element that depends, that it determines the solubility of the gas in a liquid is about the temperature. But again, in this case, in the case of the blood, doesn't affect too much because Ideally, our body is keeping the homeostasis, body temperature homeostasis, that is 37 Celsius. The one that really affects the solubility of the gas, or how much these two gases can be dissolved in plasma, refer to the pressure of the gas. In other words, how much is the concentration? We mentioned before that concentration is also matching with pressure. Higher the concentration, higher the pressure of that gas, and is the determining factor in how oxygen and carbon dioxide can be dissolved in plasma. In this graphic that represents the terminal bronchioles with the alveolar sacs, you have the visualization on how that particular very intense, dense network of capillaries are wrapping around the alveolar sacs and any single alveoli. And the function is to assure that perfusion in order to match with the ventilation. So both together, ventilation that represent breathe in, breathe out, is the air that is filling the alveoli, is working very closely with the perfusion, and between each other are the ones that help to keep that concentration, ideal concentration and ratio between oxygen and carbon dioxide. Therefore, ventilation have to match with perfusion and perfusion have to match with ventilation. How they are matching between each other is adjusting the blood flow into the capillaries around the alveoli. Now, from previous chapters, you know that the beginning of any capillary bed is produced by the arteriole, that is the smallest artery in our system. That arteriole has the capability to vasoconstrict or vasodilate according with the need at that time, because by vasoconstriction or vasodilation, they increase or decrease the blood flow. In other words, let's pretend a first scenario that pulmonary arteriole constrict and reduce the blood flow around that alveoli capillary. Why that arteriole has to be constrict? If the oxygen level in the alveolus is reduced, so we reduce the blood flow in order to keep that famous ratio oxygen-carbon dioxide in level. On the contrary, that pulmonary arteriole dilates, in other words, increase the blood flow if the oxygen level in the alveolus increase, dilate in order to pick up more oxygen from that alveolus. So the blood flow to alveoli is increased when they are full of oxygen and decreased when they are not full in oxygen. Simultaneously, what happened at the systemic arterioles? In those systemic arterioles happen exactly the opposite. Now, what happened in the systemic arterioles and why? Keep in mind the scenario that these arterioles are the beginning of capillary beds in the tissues. What happened with the tissues? The tissues can be exposed or involved in high metabolic activity or not. Now, if the tissue is exposed to high metabolic activity, produce a larger amount of carbon dioxide, but also increase the demand of oxygen. So with this one in mind, let's keep the scenario. That systemic arteriole constrict means that reduce the blood flow if oxygen in the tissue is high. In other words, why we have high concentration of oxygen in a tissue? Because that tissue, those cells, are not exposed to high metabolic activity, so they have enough oxygen. Because of that, the systemic arteriole need to vasoconstrict, reduce the blood flow in order to do not supply more oxygen to this tissue that is already with enough amount of oxygen. On the contrary, the systemic arteriole dilate, increase the blood flow if the oxygen level in that tissue is low. Why is low? Because the metabolic activity in that tissue is very high, and higher the metabolic activity, higher has to be the production of ATP, and higher has to be the supply of oxygen. So by vasodilation of that arteriole, increase the blood flow and increase the probabilities, in fact, what is happening, increase the supply of oxygen to that tissue that is involved in high metabolic activity. This ensures that only tissues that need oxygen are sent blood. And this one is the key of everything. So between the pulmonary arteries and the systemic arteries, pulmonary arterioles and systemic arterioles are between each other the one that keep that ventilation perfusion ratio that determine the ideal concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide in plasma. Another important concept about ventilation perfusion ratio is about the resistance of the capillaries in the two main parts, either around the alveoli at the lungs level or around the tissues that are the systemic capillaries. Because at the systemic capillaries, that particular capillaries, they have a high resistance and they have a high filtration, because remember, what is the function of these capillaries around the tissue? Systemic capillaries is increase the filtration to nourish that tissue as much as possible, but also pick up the waste that is carbon dioxide and water, uric acid as well. There are different molecules that are considered waste, but basically the systemic capillaries, they have a high resistance and a high filtration. On the contrary, the alveolus capillaris, they have a low resistance and very low filtration, because we don't need filtration in the alveolus capillaris. We just need diffusion of gases. We need to diffuse carbon dioxide inside of the alveoli, and we need to pick up oxygen from that alveoli inside the capillaries. Because of that, we don't need filtration, and it's another system that our physiology has in place in order to avoid pulmonary edema that is not desirable at all. To understand the regulation of breathing, we need to understand how that skeletal muscles that we use for breathing uh, are controlled. And they are controlled by motor neurons. That motor neurons, remember that the motor neurons are the one emerging from the central nervous system to reach the effectors. And those effectors can be voluntary or involuntary. Obviously, you learn from anatomy that the skeletal muscles are voluntary, but it's very interesting to know how these skeletal muscles involved in breathing are innervated by autonomic motor neurons. Now, that motor neurons are the ones that innervate the diaphragm. The diaphragm is the main muscle of breathing, certainly, and is innervated by a phrenic nerve. A phrenic nerve is one nerve emerging from the spinal cord. Spinal cord is central nervous system. That spinal cord produces several plexus, and the plexus that is emerging at the cervical area produce that spinal nerve that is continue going down and innervate the diaphragm. Now, there are another muscles involved rather than the diaphragm. And these other muscles are innervated from the thoracolumbar region of the spinal cord. And if you remember, the thoracolumbar region of the spinal cord are the one that is produced by the parasympathetic nervous system, because the parasympathetic nervous system is the system that regulates our breathing most of the time. It's the one that stimulates the breathing rate, and is the sympathetic nervous system that inhibits the breathing rate. It's interesting because most of the time we learn that the sympathetic nervous system stimulates that function, but in the digestive system and in the respiratory system, just to mention two of those, they are regulated by the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, you probably think, why, if the breathing is voluntary, is regulated by the autonomic nervous system? Well, let me tell you why. Because we have two types of breathing. One that is voluntary and the other one that is involuntary. We certainly can produce and can regulate our breathing if we engage, for example, in a yoga class that the professor is telling you how you have to breathe, how you have to increase the deepness of your breathing, how you have to exhale, and all that. So you are in control of your breathing and in control of those muscles. This one is the voluntary part that is controlled from the cerebral cortex, because you think about it, you send the message to the central nervous system, and the cerebral cortex is the one that is analyzing the need. But we have also the involuntary breathing. The involuntary breathing is regulated by control centers in the medulla oblongata and the pons. And we use both voluntary and involuntary breathing. Most of the time we use the involuntary breathing. And in those medulla oblongata and pons, we have three centers. One is called amnestic center, that is the one that stimulates inhalation, increase inhalation, and the pneumotaxis center that decrease or inhibit the inhalation. This amnestic that increase inhalation or pneumotaxis that inhibit inhalation both regulate the deepness of the breathing. How deep, how intense is normal breathing or is forced breathing? So these two centers are located in the medulla oblongata and the pons. But we have another center that is called rhythmicity center. That rhythmicity center is the one that regulates the breathing rate, that, by the way, differ between a child, a young adult, an old adult, or elderly. Obviously, that breathing rate is way faster. Younger we are, that breathing rate is way faster, because it's accordingly with the metabolism of that person. And older we are, that breathing rate is decreasing in normal conditions. But remember the three centers: amnestic center, pneumotaxis center, and rhythmicity center in that brain stem that regulate both deepness and rate of the breathing. Now, if you use your voluntary breathing, that you think about what you need to produce or to do in terms of the breathing, you inform the central nervous system in the cortex. And this cortex, that is gray matter, very dense in neurons body and neurons dendrites, are the one that send the message to that brainstem in the pons, where we have the amnestic center, the pneumotaxic center, and the rhythmicity area, both between the pons and the medulla oblongata. But I want to emphasize that that cerebral cortex send a message to the pons, and the pons send a message to the medulla oblongata. I want to emphasize that because this breathing center or respiratory centers are in both areas, in the pons and in the medulla oblongata. At the same time, we have also in the pons and medulla oblongata the cardio center in both. So imagine that when we increase the breathing rate, we simultaneously increase the heart rate, as is not a coincidence. It's just because these two centers are informed simultaneously about the need of the body. This need could be voluntary and most of the time is involuntary. As I mentioned before, the breathing rate and the deepness of breathing is regulated in our body by involuntary movement most of the time. Now, how that breathing deepness and rate is affected is because we have chemoreceptors. That chemoreceptors are the ones that sense specific molecules, and that specific molecules are oriented to check the pH of the fluid. In this case, is plasma. The pH of the fluid in the brain and the pH of the plasma in general. That chemoreceptors also are checking and monitoring the pressure of carbon dioxide and the pressure of oxygen in the blood. That chemoreceptors can be organized in two main groups. One are called central chemoreceptors, and that central chemoreceptors are around the centers we just mentioned before, around the pons and medulla oblongata, the central chemoreceptors. And the peripheral chemoreceptors are located around the two carotids and the aorta arteries, but specifically in the aorta arch. In that aorta arch and that carotids, we have the carotid bodies and aortic bodies, where we have the chemoreceptors. The other one, the central chemoreceptors, are around the pons and medulla oblongata. In this graphic, you have the representation on how the representation of the two pathways for the two types of breathing, the voluntary breathing and the involuntary breathing. If we produce a voluntary breathing, as I mentioned before, that you are exercising, and the most clear image that I can give you is if you engage in, for example, a yoga class, because most of the time in a yoga class you have to be in control of your breathing and you have to follow the direction that you need to inhale and you need to exhale, and right now you have to increase the breathing rate or you have to decrease the breathing rate. So all that kind of breathing is voluntary. In this case, you think about it, send a message to the cerebral cortex that is rich in the cerebral cortex is basically gray matter, rich in neurons bodies and neuron dendrites, and this cerebral cortex send a message directly to the spinal cord, and in the spinal cord are emerging the motor neurons that will reach the respiratory muscles. The one that we need to use depends with the intensity of that breathing. And this one is the circuit or pathway for voluntary breathing. However, in an involuntary breathing that is directed by the levels of carbon dioxide, hydrogen, and oxygen, it depends one or the other one, and I'm going to explain later on, That cerebral cortex is informed about those levels through the chemoreceptors. Now that chemoreceptors are reaching, the pathway is reaching the pons, and from the pons the medulla oblongata. And the medulla oblongata sends a message to the spinal cord that is acting through that motor neurons to reach the respiratory muscles. Now, another important topic that you need to visualize over here is that the cerebral cortex can reach directly the medulla oblongata without passing through the pons. Why is that? You will learn in the following slides about it. If we need to increase just the breathing rate, for example, we reach automatically the medulla oblongata, and the medulla oblongata send the message to the spinal cord without passing through the pons. But if we need to increase or decrease the breathing rate, certainly the cerebral cortex need to use the pons, because in the pons we have the amnestic center or the pneumotaxis center. I want you to be very focused in these following slides, starting here, because are really very important for you to understand the effect of the pH and the relation of the pH concentration with the pressure of carbon dioxide and ventilation. There is always a rate that is matching accordingly with the blood pH, with the pressure of carbon dioxide, and matching with the ventilation that is needed to keep these values in balance. Now, keep in mind that when ventilation or breathing is inadequate, the level of carbon dioxide increase. And if the level of carbon dioxide increase, automatically increase the levels of hydrogen. Now, if we increase the level of hydrogen in a fluid, we decrease the pH of that fluid. How this one is coming from? Remember, at the tissue level, and I want you to be focused in this equation or this chemical reaction. At the systemic capillaries, that particular cells in the tissues, they produce as a waste material after the cell respiration carbon dioxide and water. These two substrates, these two molecules combine produce carbonic acid. Now, the carbonic acid is very unstable, very weak molecule, and is easily split into other molecules, that is hydrogen and bicarbonate. In this way, you know and you visualize that if I increase carbon dioxide in that fluid, automatically increase the hydrogen ions in the same fluid. That's why if we increase the carbon dioxide, automatically decrease the blood pH because increase the hydrogen ions. Now, let's pretend scenario number one, the one that I described over here in order for you to play with to analyze. Increase of hydrogen in plasma decrease the pH. Then, it is sensed by those chemoreceptors, either the peripheral or the central. Those chemoreceptors informs the cerebral cortex, and the cerebral cortex pass the information to the pons and medulla oblongata. Inform that increase the levels of hydrogen. Now, because increase the levels of hydrogen and carbon dioxide, automatically the response will be increase the breathing rate to eliminate more carbon dioxide. and induce our body in hyperventilation. Now, increasing the breathing rate, we eliminate more carbon dioxide. And eliminating more carbon dioxide is the one that the level of pH increase because decrease the level of carbon dioxide and decrease the level of hydrogen. In scenario number 2, on the opposite, after a while of increasing that ventilation, because we get into hyperventilation, right? Not necessarily has to be pathological, but certainly our body uses that mechanism, hyperventilate, in order to eliminate more carbon dioxide and increase the pH that was decreased. In the scenario number 2, after a while of the ventilation increase, the concentration of carbon dioxide decrease. And it's possible that if decrease to the level that those chemoreceptors detected. Now, what is the reaction that takes place? And how we are going to retain more carbon dioxide? On the opposite way, in order to retain more carbon dioxide in plasma, we reduce the breathing rate. We produce hypoventilation. Now, in hypoventilation, the chemical reaction is that the bicarbonate is absorbing hydrogen. Bicarbonate is absorbing hydrogen. Now, absorbing hydrogen is converted in carbonic acid. And in this way, bicarbonate has the function to absorb the excess of hydrogen. And this one is how we increase the pH in that scenario. Now, oxygen levels do not change as rapidly because of oxygen reserves in hemoglobin, and that one is a very powerful statement. We always try to think that our body sends the levels of oxygen most of the time, and it's not. Our body, the chemoreceptors, are more sensitive to the levels of hydrogen and carbon dioxide rather than oxygen levels. Why? Because oxygen level is pretty much is a molecule that our body needs, but carbon dioxide and hydrogen affect tremendously the pH, and these chemoreceptors are more open, more willing to be sensed by the levels of carbon dioxide and hydrogen that pretty much is a waste that we don't need to accumulate in our body, because those are the ones affecting by increasing or decreasing the blood pH. So ventilation is controlled to maintain constant levels of carbon dioxide in the blood. Oxygen levels naturally follow. This is a very clear graphic about the effect of hypoventilation, normal ventilation, and hyperventilation accordingly with the levels of pressure of carbon dioxide. So, in hypoventilation, the pressure of carbon dioxide that is the blue line or the blue column, reach to up to 80. Remember, the normal level of carbon dioxide in plasma is 40 millimeters of mercury, but in hypoventilation can reach up to 80 millimeters of mercury. In normal ventilation, the levels of carbon dioxide remain normal, 40 millimeters of mercury. However, in hypoventilation, the level of carbon dioxide drop above 20 millimeters of mercury. That is also decompensated. Remember, the normal value of carbon dioxide pressure is 40 plus or -2 millimeters of mercury. We mentioned before about the central or peripheral chemoreceptors. This graphic represents the central chemoreceptors that are around the medulla oblongata. And that central chemoreceptors are more sensitive to the levels of carbon dioxide rather than hydrogen. And the peripheral chemoreceptors that are around the aortic arch and carotid bodies responds to the change in hydrogen levels. And that peripheral receptors responds way much faster. Now, in that chemoreceptors that are represented over here, represent the metabolic activity of that neurons. And that neurons in the chemoreceptors are sensitive to the levels of carbon dioxide, mainly because there are central chemoreceptors. And as I mentioned before, are more sensitive to the levels of carbon dioxide. Now, in this case, in the yellow line in the middle, represent the cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. And this cerebrospinal fluid is more sensitive to the levels of carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide can join with water in plasma, producing carbonic acid, and that weak molecule is split in hydrogen and bicarbonate. Now, in this way, that medulla oblongata next to has the chemoreceptors to sense levels of mainly carbon dioxide, but not only, could be hydrogen too. The important things about it is it doesn't matter if the central chemoreceptors are more sensitive to carbon dioxide than hydrogen, and the peripheral are more sensitive to hydrogen than carbon dioxide. Both chemoreceptors sense both hydrogen and carbon. Please try to follow the pathway meanwhile I'm talking. The scenario presented in this graphic is in case we decrease the ventilation. If we decrease the ventilation or breathing, automatically the levels of carbon dioxide increase. And if this level increase, automatically decrease the blood pH because we increase the concentration of hydrogen. Now, this decrease in the pH is sensed by the peripheral chemoreceptors or the central chemoreceptors located in the brainstem and is located in that box, yellow box that you have in your left. Regardless if because it really doesn't matter what kind of chemoreceptors sense that drop in the blood pH, if it is the peripheral or if it is the central. What is important is that one or the other one inform the respiratory center, in the pons and medulla oblongata. Those respiratory centers are informed that the blood pH decrease, means that increase the hydrogen ions and increase the concentration of carbon dioxide. Because of that, that respiratory center use the spinal cord motor neurons emerging from those and reach the respiratory muscles that automatically increase the ventilation rate and increase the ventilation deepness. Why? Because we need to eliminate more carbon dioxide and increase the blood pH. As I mentioned before, after a while that we increase the ventilation, we need to recover the normal because eventually if we keep in hyperventilation, that blood pH increase too much for lack amount of carbon dioxide. Remember, the normal level of carbon dioxide in blood, in plasma, is an average of 40 millimeters of mercury. If we go farther below that level, we need to produce again the same circuit, inform the central nervous system that the levels of carbon dioxide decrease too much and we need to decrease the ventilation. In this graphic, you have more information about the different type of receptors and the location of those, either peripheral or central, and how they are more sensitive one to the other one, to the different values, pH, carbon dioxide, or oxygen, or even hydrogen. But the point is that, frankly, what you have to keep in mind is what happens if increase the pressure of carbon dioxide above the normal level and how this one affect the pH. On the contrary, the same thing what happens when the pressure of carbon dioxide decrease below the level and how this one affect the pH. Now, really, it doesn't matter if you know or if you have very clear that is sensed by the peripheral or the central chemoreceptor. What really you have to know is what is the reaction that our physiology is using in order to compensate that deviation of the normal level. Probably I didn't mention before that carbon dioxide is highly dissolvable in plasma rather than oxygen. Oxygen is a gas that is not really doesn't have really high solubility in plasma, but carbon dioxide has. However, the carbon dioxide need to be converted in different molecules in order to be transported in plasma that I will talk in the following slides. Now is the time to refer about the oxygen transport, and oxygen is transported in the larger amount of those. I mean 85% of oxygen is transported in the molecule that is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin, we talked before about the hemoglobin that is a protein and that is included in the erythrocyte in a very large amount, 280 millions of hemoglobin molecules per erythrocyte, and how is composed. That hemoglobin is composed by four globin molecules that are 2 alpha, 2 beta, and inside that globin molecules contain the hemiring with the iron molecule. So basically, oxygen is bonded with the iron only. How much? We have 4 iron molecules per hemoglobin, so any single hemoglobin is capable to transport up to 4 molecules of oxygen. From the different type of hemoglobin, we can identify the one that is called oxyhemoglobin. The oxyhemoglobin is when the iron is reduced and can bond with oxygen. That one is the normal state of hemoglobin, that is when the capillaries or the blood is emerging from the lungs, where that erythrocytes has the capability to intake the maximum amount of oxygen, oxyhemoglobin. Now we have the other type that is the oxyhemoglobin and is reduced hemoglobin when the oxygen detach from iron. The oxyhemoglobin doesn't mean that it is empty absolutely of oxygen, but certainly the oxyhemoglobin is the hemoglobin that after the capillary bed is emerging and is transported to the right side of the heart, because from the right side of the heart need to be pumped, the blood is pumped to the lungs and is right there in the lungs when that erythrocyte has the capability, hemoglobin included erythrocyte, has the capability to bond with other oxygen molecules. Another type of hemoglobin is called oxidized hemoglobin that is absolutely abnormal, totally abnormal, and some drugs can cause it. You don't have to be focused on that. But certainly carboxyhemoglobin is another abnormal hemoglobin, but is probably the most known because is when the iron is bonded with carbon monoxide. Instead to bond with oxygen, carbon monoxide has the capability to has a stronger bond and faster. So they compete. Carbon monoxide in the air produce emission from a heater or from a car or from a stove that produce carbon monoxide in the air is competing at the time is bonded with iron. And what happens when the hemoglobin is facing two molecules, one carbon monoxide, one oxygen, the carbon monoxide is faster to bond with oxygen. And in that competition, oxygen is losing at the time that the patient can die for it. Now, the normal percentage of oxyhemoglobin is the 97%. That is most of the time when it's emerging from the left ventricle. When it's emerging from the left ventricle, that hemoglobin is fully charged in oxygen. Now, hemoglobin is another way to measure the oxygen carry capacity of blood and is measure the hemoglobin concentration. In lab, for those who are taking lab, you were exposed to different lab exercise that is using the measurement of hemoglobin. In previous chapter, you were knowledgeable about the hemoglobin concentration in males or females that are determining normal levels that determine the oxygen carry capacity, because basically is the hemoglobin concentration decrease the oxygen carrying capacity. We talk also about anemia. But anemia is not only related about the concentration of hemoglobin, it's also relating about the concentration or the amount of red blood cells per cubic millimeter of blood, but it's also related with other abnormalities. Certainly, one of the anemias can be diagnosed for low levels of hemoglobin. The other opposite disorder is called polycythemia, and polycythemia are related to that abnormal levels or erythrocyte and also accordingly the abnormal high levels of hemoglobin. And this one, very common scenario that the patient incur in polycythemia is when he's exposed to high altitudes. Because in high altitudes, the oxygen levels are reduced. And when the body sends the low levels of oxygen, the body doesn't understand that it's in high altitude. The body only understands that the oxygen levels are reduced. And because of that, is increase the production of erythropoietin that increase the production of red blood cells in the bone marrow, and increasing the production of red blood cells increase also the hemoglobin concentration. So polycythemia is related to those. Loading and unloading of hemoglobin in the red blood cells could be a challenge for you to study, but I'm going to concentrate two words, that is loading and affinity. loading and affinity, because in the book you will find that these two topics are separated between each other, but certainly are really matching between each other, because the loading increase and the hemoglobin affinity increase with oxygen. So loading increase of hemoglobin is also increasing the affinity of the hemoglobin with oxygen. When can happen? When hemoglobin binds with oxygen in the lungs. Is right there, and remember, the gases are moving from high concentration to lower concentration. When we just breathe in, the concentration of oxygen inside the alveoli is huge, and it's easy to pass by diffusion from the alveoli into the capillaries, and in the capillaries jumping into the erythrocyte where we have the hemoglobin. So that loading of hemoglobin with oxygen increase at the capillary levels, at the lungs capillaries or alveoli capillaries. Now, increasing the loading is because increase the affinity of hemoglobin with oxygen. And remember, the pressure of oxygen in the alveoli is higher than in the alveoli capillary. And because of that, oxygen moves from, by diffusion, from the alveoli into the bloodstream, the capillary around, and is right there when they have the chance to jump into the hemoglobin. That's why increase the loading and increase the affinity. And is when we create or we change from the oxyhemoglobin, now charged with oxygen and is converted in oxyhemoglobin, from the lungs goes back to the right side of the heart where we have the atrium, receiving that oxyhemoglobin in the erythrocyte into the left atrium, and from the left atrium to the left ventricle. And the left ventricle has the function to pump that oxyhemoglobin outside the heart and send it to the systemic circuit. Now, we finished to talk about the loading and affinity with oxygen. Now it's time to talk about the unloading that represent decreased hemoglobin affinity with oxygen. When we have decreased unloading, when we have decreased affinity of oxygen and we facilitate the unloading of hemoglobin with that oxygen, it happens at the tissue level. When oxyhemoglobin drops of oxygen in the tissue, that is decreasing the affinity of hemoglobin with oxygen and is facilitating the unloading. Happen at the tissue level, because at the tissue level that cells need oxygen for cell respiration, and gases move always from higher pressure to lower pressure. Right now we have a high pressure of oxygen inside the systemic capillary, and we have a lower pressure of oxygen in the interstitial fluid around the cells. And this scenario is facilitating the unloading of hemoglobin of oxygen, is dropping the oxygen out, and in other words, is decreasing the hemoglobin affinity with oxygen. That in these two ways you have an idea about how loading and unloading is matching with affinity or increase the affinity or decrease the affinity of that hemoglobin with oxygen. Now, at the tissue level, that oxyhemoglobin that was coming from the left ventricle when it's losing oxygen, is converted in the oxyhemoglobin again that need to go back to the right atrium, right ventricle, and pumping out again to the lungs to be recharged with oxygen. In other words, high pressure of oxygen in the alveoli favors the loading, and the low pressure of oxygen in the systemic capillaries favors the unloading. Now, the systemic arteries have a pressure of oxygen that is an average of 100 millimeters of mercury, and the systemic veins have a pressure of oxygen that is an average 40 millimeters of mercury. In other words, when that circuit is initiated, the systemic circuit is initiated, the pressure of oxygen is high, and after the systemic capillaries, that pressure of oxygen drops drastically from 100 to 40 millimeters of mercury, and in that way is coming back to the right side of the heart. How carbon dioxide in transport in plasma? We talk in different opportunities during previous chapters in the semester. Carbon dioxide is most of the time transported inside another molecule, and this molecule is bicarbonate. It's most of the time. Now, how carbon dioxide can be transported, can be converted in bicarbonate is using the carbonic anhydrase enzyme inside the red blood cell. So the red blood cell is not only charged with hemoglobin, also is charged with carbonic anhydrase. And that carbonic anhydrase produces two different reactions. It depends what kind of capillary is located. If we are talking about the alveoli capillaries or if we talk about the systemic capillaries. In the systemic capillaries, that carbonic anhydrase is using two substrates that are carbon dioxide and water. This carbon dioxide and water is produced by the cells as waste material after cell respiration. After they produce ATP, the waste material is carbon dioxide and water. Now, these are the two substrates used by the carbonic anhydrase. And after that, these two substrates are used by the enzyme, the final product is carbonic acid. This carbonic acid, as I mentioned before, is very unstable, is very weak molecule, and is rapidly dissociated into bicarbonate and hydrogen. These two molecules, bicarbonate and hydrogen, are dumped in the plasma. So keep in mind that inside that bicarbonate we have the carbon dioxide, and most of the time is hidden in that bicarbonate. Now, at the alveoli capillaries, after all the swimming inside the blood, most of the time hidden in that bicarbonate, at the alveoli capillaries, that carbonic anhydrase enzyme use two different substrates. The two substrates that is using is the bicarbonate and hydrogen. And after the carbonic anhydrase enzyme, the new product is again carbonic acid that is rapidly dissociated in two different molecules. One is carbon dioxide and the other one is water. The carbon dioxide is fully 100% diffused into the alveoli to be breathed out, and is the only way we have to eliminate carbon dioxide from our body. However, the water that is the other molecule produced after this chemical reaction, 50%, roughly 50%, is eliminated in the breathe out. Is the reason why we produce vapor when we breathe out, and it's another way to lose water in our system. But the other 50% roughly remain in plasma because, the main component of plasma is water. You have here the two chemical reactions that take place in both capillaries. In the systemic capillaries, that is the first one, bolded, and the second one produced at the systemic capillaries. And you have to be very knowledgeable about these two reactions. I mentioned before that the main way we transport carbon dioxide is converted in bicarbonate, but there are another two ways to transport carbon dioxide. That one is dissolving plasma, is just not much, just 10%. Other 20% is transported in the hemoglobin, in part of that particular globin molecules of the hemoglobin, and the largest amount is 70% or more is transported inside that molecule that is bicarbonate. And this reaction, the one that takes place in the erythrocyte, is the one that represent in the slide before, where the two substrates used at the systemic circuit, the two substrates used are carbon dioxide and water, by which the carbonic anhydrase converted in carbonic acid. However, that carbonic acid rapidly split in two different molecules. One is hydrogen and the other one is bicarbonate. Now, if you notice in this graphic, you notice that the hydrogen can eventually combine with hemoglobin. And this one is something that is related to the capability of the hemoglobin to act as a buffer as well, because if a molecule is capable to absorb a hydrogen molecule, is acting as a buffer. And this one is a little explanation how the hemoglobin also is helping as a buffer in the plasma. As I mentioned before, the carbonic anhydrase is using different substrates if that erythrocyte is along the systemic capillaries or is inside the alveoli capillaries. This scenario, that is the graphic that you are watching right now, represent the erythrocyte inside the alveoli capillaries. And as I mentioned before, the substrate used by this carbonic anhydrase at the alveoli capillary are not the same one that in the systemic capillaries. The substrate here are using the bicarbonate and is using the hydrogen that is also from plasma. Now, using these two substrates and using the carbonic anhydrase is converted into carbonic acid, and carbonic acid rapidly is split into other products. One is carbon dioxide and the other one is water. And as I mentioned before, carbon dioxide is fully 100% diffused into the alveoli to be breathed out and eliminated from our body. At this time of the semester, you are fully aware that the blood pH need to be in balance. Certainly is very sensitive and is very tight range, but there are only two systems capable to maintain that balance: the blood pH balance or the acid-base balance. The two systems are the respiratory system and the urinary system. How the respiratory system can regulate the blood pH? By breathing in or breathing out, especially breathing out or the rate of respiration or ventilation. How the urinary system can keep this acid-base imbalance is just regulating the concentration of bicarbonate that is a powerful buffer in our bloodstream. And remember that values that you have to keep in consideration. One is the normal level of carbon dioxide that I mentioned before. An average is 40 millimeters of mercury because measure pressure of carbon dioxide. On regards, the levels of bicarbonate are measured in milli equivalents per liter, and the value depends with the author, depends with the lab, is between 22 to 26 milli equivalents per liter. Now keep in mind about the chemical reaction that take place at the bottom of this slide. When you read bicarbonate plus hydrogen produce carbonic acid, but you see the arrow that goes back and forth. What does it mean that when carbon dioxide is converted in bicarbonate and hydrogen, most of the time remain hidden in that molecule. But certainly these two molecules, bicarbonate and carbonic acid, are in constant fluctuation because what happened in the regulation of the blood pH most of the time is regulated when it's a slight or is a little deviation from the normal range of that pH is adjusting by these two molecules. In other words, if we have that the blood pH, let's pretend that the blood pH increase between from 7.45 to 7.50 or including even a little bit more, that could be 8. But a little deviation to be more alkaline represents that there is less concentration of hydrogen. Am I right? Now, in this scenario, that carbonic acid is releasing hydrogen in the bloodstream, and releasing hydrogen is because it's converted in bicarbonate and hydrogen. Now, the carbon dioxide that was hidden in carbonic acid now is hidden in bicarbonate. And hidden in bicarbonate plus hydrogen increase the concentration of hydrogen, and automatically the blood pH drop from that little increase down to the normal range. Now let's pretend that the blood pH in our system drop a little below 735. Let's pretend that reach a level of 7. In that level of 7, when it's deviated and it's a little deviation, we use our physiology use the other chemical reaction. The bicarbonate start to absorbing hydrogen ion and is converted in carbonic acid. Absorbing hydrogen from the fluid increase the pH and recover the normal value. What is important about that is that bicarbonate and carbonic acid are fluctuating between each other all the time. So from that tissue level, that carbonic anhydrase that convert the carbon dioxide into bicarbonate ending up, that bicarbonate can be fluctuated in carbonic acid or carbonic acid back in bicarbonate accordingly with the little deviation in the blood pH. And this one is the system our physiology use. Most of the time we are not aware about it, but is the one that is happening by itself. It's auto control. Now, if that system is not enough to compensate the deviation of the blood pH, we engage the respiratory system either by increasing or decreasing the ventilation. Now, as I mentioned before, when that system between these two molecules, carbonic acid and bicarbonate, that fluctuate between each other, one or the other one, to adjust the little deviation in the blood pH, is not enough, when this system is not enough, we certainly need to engage the respiratory system. And respiratory system is always the first response, obviously if the lungs are healthy, adjusting the breathing rate. Now, if we have a blood acidosis, that is above that level that can be adjusted when it's below 735, that is more than can be adjusted by the two molecules, bicarbonate and carbonic acid. If we have that kind of acidosis that is more remarkable, now the respiratory system take place, increasing the breathing rate, because increasing the breathing rate, we eliminate more carbon dioxide. On the contrary, if our blood pH reach a level of alkalosis that is not possible to be managed by these two molecules, bicarbonate and carbonic acid, we need to decrease the breathing rate. We need to engage the respiratory system, decreasing the breathing rate. Why? Because decreasing the breathing rate, we retain more carbon dioxide. Now, the second response is happening in the kidneys, and the kidneys can or cannot compensate the action of the respiratory system. And let me explain you how the kidney is working if we have a blood acidosis or a blood alkalosis. If we have a blood acidosis, that a kidney increase, and please pay attention about that, increase the bicarbonate reabsorption. Because remember, bicarbonate can absorb hydrogen ions. So increasing the reabsorption from the renal tubes in the nephrons, we reabsorb bicarbonate and we keep it in our stream. And that bicarbonate is the one that will absorb hydrogen ions. And the other system that the kidneys are using, the nephrons are using, is increase the secretion of hydrogen. We don't want too much hydrogen in our bloodstream. We need to secrete and eliminate in urine. Now, the alkalosis, a blood alkalosis that want to be compensated by the kidneys, are using a different effect. Alkalosis, keep in mind, alkalosis has a very low level of or reduced level of hydrogen ions. So in that scenario, we need to increase the secretion of bicarbonate because we don't want reabsorption of hydrogen. We need to keep the hydrogen that we have. So our physiology in our nephron will increase the secretion of bicarbonate to be eliminated in urine, but also increase the reabsorption of hydrogen to keep more hydrogen in our plasma. And in this way, we compensate the alkalosis in the bloodstream. I want to emphasize that the system, the respiratory system, is acting fast, but the urinary system is very low and it takes several days to adjust the blood pH. So that is the reason why the first response are the two little molecules, bicarbonate and carbonic acid. If these two are not able to compensate the blood pH, the second is the respiratory system. And that respiratory system can be also helped by the kidneys that is produce a more compensation in these two actions with the bicarbonate and hydrogen. So try to analyze little by little, step by step, but you really have to be knowledgeable about those. I took the time to prepare these special slides for you that include all the topics that you have to be knowledgeable about the different type of acidosis that we can produce, acidosis or alkalosis we can produce in our body. Now, that kind of acidosis or alkalosis are the ones that are not capable to be balanced out by the two famous molecules, bicarbonate and carbonic acid. When these two molecules are not capable, we can incur in respiratory or metabolic acidosis or alkalosis. The respiratory acidosis or alkalosis are the one that is produced by abnormalities in the respiratory system, and the metabolic acidosis or alkalosis are the one produced in different areas or for different reasons rather than problems in the respiratory system. Now, let's go to the different type of respiratory acidosis or respiratory alkalosis. This respiratory acidosis is caused by hypoventilation. How we can produce hypoventilation? It could be produced by depressor of the central nervous system. It's a medication that depresses the central nervous system, and we can keep in hypoventilation. And the body will compensate increasing the breathing rate. The other type of respiratory acidosis is produced by any type of respiratory disorder, either obstructive or restrictive. Any kind of those can produce a respiratory acidosis because basically the patient cannot eliminate the levels of carbon dioxide that need to be removed from our body. In respiratory alkalosis, the reason is also produced by the respiratory system, and the most common reason we produce respiratory alkalosis is by if we have a panic attack and we produce hyperventilation, and that hyperventilation is pathological because we eliminate too much carbon dioxide, more than the amount needed, and the blood pH start to increase because there is less amount of carbon dioxide, and obviously parallel to that is less amount of hydrogen. And it's the reason why if the patient is having a panic attack and you don't have, meanwhile emergency is coming to your place, the most common domestic medicine is to give the patient a paper bag where the patient breathe in and breathe out inside that paper bag, because breathing out eliminates carbon dioxide, and when breathing is keeping that carbon dioxide in the system as well. Sometimes it's easy to be compensated in this way, and sometimes it's not, and the patient needs to be treated in emergency. Now, it's important, and I keep it bolded and with the arrow, that the respiratory acidosis or alkalosis is measured by the levels of carbon dioxide or hydrogen. And remember, we have the osmoreceptors that measure the level of carbon dioxide and the levels of hydrogen. That osmoreceptors, either central or peripheric, are the ones that detect abnormal levels and try to adjust the breathing rate if possible. If the patient has a respiratory disease, sometimes the patient can, sometimes the patient cannot, and the patient needs to be sent to emergency room. And in respiratory alkalosis, same scenario. Sometimes the patient can recover the emotional normal status and reduce the ventilation and little by little recover. And sometimes the patient needs to be sent to emergency room. Now, in metabolic acidosis, There are different reasons the patient can produce a metabolic acidosis. I wrote just two of those because overdose is unfortunately a very common reason that the patient produce acidosis. And remember, in any blood acidosis, regardless what type it is, if it is respiratory or metabolic, regardless, in any acidosis, the problem is that reduce the central nervous system action. And reducing the central nervous system action reduce the cardiac center and breathing center. So the patient start to reduce the ventilation rate and reduce the cardiac rate. And this one is something even worse to the scenario. When we need, in that acidosis, we need to increase the breathing rate and we need to increase the elimination of carbon dioxide. But that's why I mentioned before that sometimes it's treatable at home, and most of the time the patient needs to be sent to emergency room. So in overdose for drugs or mixing of drugs, it's very common that the patient incur in metabolic acidosis. And that one is so drastic, so acute, that the body doesn't have the time to compensate, and the patient not only pass out, the patient died. Another not so drastic scenario for metabolic acidosis could be diarrhea, a profuse diarrhea. In profuse diarrhea, we eliminate really large amount of bicarbonate that we need in our plasma in order to compensate any kind of small deviation. But another kind of metabolic acidosis can be triggered for a really disproportional amount of proteins or fatty acids in our diet. The other type of, a metabolic disorder is alkalosis, metabolic alkalosis. And a very common problem producing metabolic alkalosis is the patient is having a profuse or severe vomiting that lasts for several hours and sometimes for several days. There are different reasons why the patient can produce that severe vomiting. But certainly one of those is for food poisoning. But another one that is more important is the patient suffer bulimia, by which induce the vomiting. Inducing the vomiting or having a profuse vomiting, the patient is losing severe amount of acid from the stomach. And this one can be produce the compensation and incur in metabolic alkalosis. And very important, the levels of metabolic acidosis or alkalosis are measured by the levels of bicarbonate in our bloodstream. Now, if the patient have respiratory acidosis, not only have to increase the breathing rate, sometimes there is a compensation with the kidneys. What the kidneys are doing are reabsorbing more bicarbonate and secrete more hydrogen. And the same scenario is happening if the patient has a metabolic acidosis, can be obviously try to compensate a little bit, not just by the kidneys, compensate by the respiratory system that is increasing the breathing rate. And the same game is happening if the patient has a blood alkalosis. As I mentioned before, the ventilation is the first response um, when there is a deviation in the acid-base balance. In hypoventilation, we increase, in hypoventilation, there is an insufficient to blow off carbon dioxide, and accumulation, the pressure of carbon dioxide in our bloodstream increase also the carbonic acid and also the respiratory acidosis can be triggered. In hyperventilation is the opposite side. The rate of ventilation is faster and the amount of carbon dioxide um, uh, eliminated by breathe out increase. So hyperventilation decrease the amount of carbon dioxide levels, ideal levels in our bloodstream. So if the carbon dioxide is low and respiration is reduced, the patient incur in alkalosis, respiratory alkalosis. Now, this can be compensated or not by the kidneys. Now, if the person incurred in metabolic acidosis can be compensated with hyperventilation to allow eliminate more carbon dioxide and the levels of hydrogen decrease and the pH increase. And as I mentioned before, if the patient incurred in respiratory alkalosis on the opposite side, in metabolic alkalosis, the way that respiratory try to compensate is decreasing the breathing rate in hypoventilation. Now, the ventilation during exercise obviously have to increase to match the demand of oxygen in the tissue that allow to produce the amount of ATP desirable for that tissue, for that skeletal muscles. And obviously we need to create a hypernea that is increase the not only the increase the breathing rate, also increase the deepness of the breathing. But what is important is that we need to increase the oxygen intake because that oxygen is absolutely necessary to produce the full glucose oxidation in the three levels, in the glycolysis and inside the mitochondria using the Krebs cycle and the electron transport to produce the maximum amount of ATP. But certainly you have to be aware about the lactate threshold. And there are two different ways to express the definition of the lactate threshold. In the book, you read that the lactate threshold is the maximum rate of oxygen consumption attained before lactic acid levels rise. Now, let me explain something. I used to define lactate threshold in more easy way. And I define the lactate threshold as the maximum amount of aerobic exercise we can produce after which lactic acid start to be accumulated in the skeletal muscle. Why is that? Because it's related to the oxygen consumption and is also related to the oxygen intake. If I start to produce a physical exercise, regardless if you are an athlete or a person that never exercise, all of us, we have a lactate threshold that we reach because we produce a physical exercise based on aerobic exercise. Means that that exercise is produced by the full oxidation of glucose that produces the maximum amount of ATP. Now, when the amount of oxygen consumption is reached, that is above average 70% of the oxygen intake, when that amount of oxygen is consumed, we don't have enough amount of oxygen supply to produce the whole glucose oxidation. And because of that, in glycolysis, we produce ATP and pyruvic acid. That pyruvic acid, without enough amount of oxygen supply, cannot jump in the mitochondria and continue the glucose oxidation. And because of that, the pyruvic acid is converted in lactate acid. And lactate acid is continue building up in our muscles if we continue the physical exercise. That's why at a certain point, either the most sophisticated athlete in our planet or the most common person in our planet has a threshold, a lactate threshold. Now, if you are an athlete, you have to exercise, you can exercise longer time to reach that lactate threshold. If it is mine that I just do yoga in the regular basis, I can reach my lactate threshold if I am engaged in physical exercise way faster. But certainly, regardless, everybody can reach the lactate threshold. On regards of the respiratory adaptation to high altitude, it depends, is different if that reaction, that adaptation happen immediately or after a few days or after only one day. And also it depends how fast you can reach that high altitude, because if you are hiking in a high altitude, it takes several days and your body are simultaneously adjusting during the days to that lack of oxygen in the air. But if you, for example, travel in a plane from California to the Himalaya, and you land in the Himalaya, your body is going to be in shock for the lack of oxygen in that high altitude. So basically, what is happening, and I mentioned before, uh, your body, your physiology doesn't detect how high you are. Your physiology detects that there is a lack amount of oxygen in your system, and they try to compensate. There are symptoms also that you manifest, but certainly your physiology it will try to compensate. How is increase the production of erythropoietin, and by that is increase the production of erythrocyte and more hemoglobin. So there are more carriers for that oxygen, but certainly need to be an adaptation that it takes, it depends how fast you reach that high altitude, but that adaptation is how your body adjusts to low levels of oxygen in the air. And certainly is not going to be a topic in the test.